My name is Nora, and I'm 30 years old. I've always been the peacekeeper in my family, the one who smoothed things over when tensions rose. For years, I carried a secret that weighed on me like a stone. My mother, Rachel, was always quick to blame others for her problems, especially me. But everything changed at that family gathering last summer. As my mother stood there screaming that I had ruined her life, something inside me finally broke. The truth I had buried for 14 years came pouring out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Before I share my story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to deal with toxic family dynamics. Sometimes family secrets poison relationships from the inside out, and only the truth can set us free. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. Our family looked perfect from the outside. My father, David, was a respected high school principal. My mother, Rachel, taught piano lessons from our home. My younger brother, Ethan, was the star quarterback, and I was the straight-A student. But behind closed doors, things were very different. My mother had always been controlling and emotionally manipulative. She had a gift for turning any situation around, so that she was the victim no matter what had actually happened. If dinner was late, it was because I hadn't helped enough. If my father was quiet at the dinner table, it was because I had somehow upset him. If Ethan was struggling with homework, it was because I was showing off with my good grades and making him feel inadequate. "Nora, why do you always have to make things difficult?" was her constant refrain, delivered with a sigh that suggested she was bearing an impossible burden. My father was the peacekeeper. "Just let it go, sweetheart," he would whisper when he found me crying after one of my mother's tirades. "Your mother doesn't mean it. She's just stressed. Let's not rock the boat, okay?" His gentle eyes would plead with me to keep the peace, and because I loved him, I did. Ethan was the golden child who could do no wrong in my mother's eyes. 3 years younger than me, he learned early on that siding with Mom was the path of least resistance. I didn't blame him for it. He was just a kid trying to navigate a complicated family dynamic. But it hurt when he would join in with her criticism or laugh when she mocked my bookish ways or sensitive nature. I became the family scapegoat, the one blamed for everything that went wrong. If my mother was in a bad mood, it was because I had an attitude. If a family outing was cancelled due to rain, I had brought bad luck. It sounds ridiculous now, but when you're a child and your parent consistently makes you feel responsible for their unhappiness, you begin to believe it. One of the worst aspects was the public humiliation. My mother had no qualms about criticizing me in front of others. At a school concert when I was 12, I missed a note during my clarinet solo. Afterward, while other parents were congratulating their children, my mother loudly proclaimed, "Well, I guess all those hours of practice were wasted. Some people just don't have what it takes." The music teacher's sympathetic glance only made it worse. Despite the lack of support at home, I threw myself into academics. Books became my escape, and school became my safe haven. My teachers recognized my potential and encouraged me in ways my parents never did. By my junior year of high school, I was taking advanced placement classes and making plans for college. "I don't know why you were bothering with all those applications," my mother said one evening as I sat at the kitchen table filling out forms. "You know we can't afford to send you anywhere fancy. Besides, the community college is perfectly good for someone like you." But I was determined. I applied for every scholarship I could find, wrote countless essays, and worked part-time at the local library to save money. When the acceptance letter from the University of California came, with a substantial scholarship offer, I felt like I could finally breathe. My father was proud in his quiet way. "That's wonderful, Nora," he said, hugging me tightly. "I always knew you could do it." My mother's response was predictable. "California, that's so far away. I suppose you can't wait to abandon your family." And in a way, she was right. Going to college 2,000 miles away was my escape plan. I needed distance from the toxic environment that had shaped my childhood. I needed space to figure out who I was without my mother's constant criticism ringing in my ears. The day I left for college was both terrifying and exhilarating. My father drove me to the airport, my mother having declared herself too upset to come along. As we said goodbye at the security checkpoint, my father pressed an envelope into my hand. "I'm so proud of you, Nora," he said, his eyes misty. "Don't let anything hold you back." Inside the envelope was $500 in cash, a fortune for our family's budget, and a note that simply said, "Fly high." Those first few months at UC Berkeley were like learning to breathe again after being underwater for years. I made friends who valued me for who I was. I excelled in my classes. I discovered a passion for marketing and communications. And slowly I began to understand that I wasn't the problem. The dynamic in my family was. After graduation, I landed a job at a marketing firm in San Francisco and built a successful career. Over the next 8 years, I rose to become an executive at one of the top agencies in the city. I maintained limited contact with my family, occasional phone calls with my father, holiday cards, a brief visit home every couple of years. My relationship with my mother remained strained, conducted primarily through my father, who acted as a buffer. My brother Ethan followed a more traditional path, staying in Minnesota, marrying his high school sweetheart Jessica, and taking over my grandfather's construction business. We weren't close, but we were cordial when we did speak. He seemed content with his life, and I was happy for him. From the outside, it might have seemed like I had simply grown apart from my family, as many adults do. But there was a deeper reason for my estrangement, a secret I had carried for 14 years. A secret that would eventually shatter our carefully maintained facade of family normalcy. The real reason I kept my distance from my family, especially my mother, began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I was 16 years old. I had come home early from school because of a migraine, a common occurrence during that stressful period of my life. The house should have been empty. My father was at work, Ethan had football practice, and my mother was supposed to be at her weekly lunch with her friends, followed by grocery shopping. When I unlocked the front door, I immediately knew something was off. My mother's car was in the driveway, but so was another vehicle I recognized. The sleek black Audi belonging to my father's best friend, Thomas Wilson. Thomas and my father had been friends since college, and he was a regular visitor to our home, often joining us for Sunday dinners with his wife Laura. I called out as I entered, "Mum, are you home?" but received no answer. Thinking they might be in the backyard, I dropped my backpack in the hallway and headed toward the kitchen. That's when I heard it, my mother's unmistakable laugh coming from upstairs, followed by a man's voice speaking too low for me to make out the words. Something in my gut twisted. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, torn between the instinct to flee and a horrible curiosity. Before I could decide, I heard footsteps moving across my parents' bedroom floor. I should have left. I should have quietly slipped out the front door and pretended I had never come home. But instead, I found myself climbing the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they would hear it. The door to my parents' bedroom was slightly ajar. Through the crack I saw them, my mother and Thomas. They were both fully dressed, but Thomas was just buttoning his shirt and my mother's hair was disheveled in a way that told me everything I needed to know. They were standing close, Thomas's hand resting intimately on my mother's waist as he leaned down to kiss her. I must have made a sound, a gasp or a step that creaked, because suddenly my mother looked toward the door. Our eyes met and the colour drained from her face. "Nora?" she exclaimed, pushing Thomas away. "What are you doing home?" I couldn't speak. I felt like I was going to be sick. Thomas looked almost as shocked as my mother, but there was also something else in his expression. Resignation, as if he had always known they would eventually be caught. "Nora, sweetheart." My mother said, her voice shifting into the soothing tone she used when she wanted something. "This isn't what it looks like. Thomas just stopped by to discuss the surprise party for your father's birthday." It was such an obvious lie that I didn't even bother responding. I turned to leave, but my mother rushed after me, grabbing my arm. "Wait. Please, Nora, you can't tell your father about this. It would destroy him." I stared at her, unable to process the fact that she was more concerned about herself than about the pain she was causing. "Why?" I managed to ask. "How could you do this to Dad?" Thomas had followed her into the hallway. "Nora, this is complicated adult stuff. Your mother and I never meant for this to happen." "How long?" I demanded, looking between them. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Nora, please. You have to understand. Your father and I, things haven't been right between us for a long time. Thomas and I, it just happened." "How long?" I repeated, my voice stronger. Thomas looked away. "About a year," he admitted quietly. "A year. While my father had been working long hours to support our family, while he had been proudly introducing Thomas as the brother I never had, this betrayal had been happening right under his nose. I'm telling Dad," I said, pulling away from my mother's grasp. That's when the manipulation began in earnest. My mother collapsed onto the hallway floor, sobbing hysterically. "You'll destroy this family," she cried. "Is that what you want? To see your father heartbroken, to see your parents divorce, to ruin Ethan's stable home. He has his championship game coming up. Do you want to be responsible for ruining that too?" Thomas knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Nora, think about what this would do to Laura and our kids too. We made a terrible mistake, but telling everyone will only spread the pain. I stood there, a 16-year-old girl suddenly burdened with an adult decision that felt impossible. Tell the truth and potentially destroy 2 families, or keep a secret that felt like acid burning through my chest. I need to think, I said, finally turning away from them. My mother followed me to my room, her tears miraculously stopped now that she sensed I might be wavering. Nora, I promise this is over. Thomas and I have already decided to end it. Your father never needs to know. He deserves to know, I said, but my resolve was weakening. What good would it do? She pressed. It would only hurt him. Don't you love your father enough to protect him from that pain? And there it was, the masterful twist that was my mother's specialty. Suddenly telling the truth wasn't the moral high ground. Keeping the secret was. Suddenly I would be the one hurting my father, not them. In the end, I agreed to stay silent, a decision that would shape the next 14 years of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. What I didn't realize then was that by giving my mother this leverage, I had handed her a weapon she would use against me repeatedly. When I wanted to attend a summer writing program that would have taken me away from home for 6 weeks. If you insist on going, I might have to talk to your father about some things. He'll be so upset with both of us. When I pushed back against her criticism, you're getting quite bold for someone who's keeping such big secrets from her father. Maybe I should just tell him it was your idea for me to see Thomas. The secret became a poison in our relationship, infecting everything. It created a wall between my father and me as well. How could I look him in the eye, knowing what I knew? How could I accept his love and support while hiding such a fundamental betrayal? My mother's affair with Thomas eventually ended, or so she claimed. But the damage to my relationship with my parents was done. I withdrew, focusing on school and planning my escape to college. My father noticed the change in me, but attributed it to teenage angst. You used to tell me everything, Nora, he said once, the hurt evident in his voice. I missed that. The guilt was overwhelming. Not only was I keeping this terrible secret, but I was also causing my father pain by pulling away from him. He became depressed during my senior year, and I couldn't help but feel responsible. If I had told him the truth right away, maybe he could have confronted the situation and begun healing. Instead, I had helped my mother maintain her deception, and we were all suffering for it. The secret followed me to college, and beyond a shadow that never quite disappeared. It affected my relationships with men. I found it difficult to trust always waiting for betrayal. It influenced my infrequent visits home, making them tense and uncomfortable, and it cemented my decision to keep my distance from my family, especially my mother. For 14 years, I carried this burden alone, until the family gathering that changed everything. The call came on a Tuesday evening as I was preparing to leave my office. My brother Ethan's number flashed on my phone screen, unusual enough to make me answer immediately. Dad's had a heart attack, he said without preamble. It's not major, they're calling it a mild one, but he's in the hospital. Mum wanted me to call you. My blood ran cold. Is he going to be okay? They think so. He's stable and the doctors are optimistic. But Nora... Ethan's voice broke slightly. He was asking for you. I booked a flight that night, packed a small suitcase, and by the next afternoon I was walking into the Minneapolis hospital where my father was recovering. It had been 3 years since my last visit home, and the thought of seeing my family again, especially under these circumstances, filled me with anxiety. In the weeks leading up to the trip, I had multiple sessions with my therapist, working through coping strategies for dealing with my mother. Remember your boundaries, Dr. Lewis had advised. You're not that vulnerable 16-year-old anymore. You're a successful adult who gets to decide how much access people have to your life. I repeated those words to myself as I approached my father's hospital room. Through the glass, I could see him lying in bed, looking smaller and frailer than I remembered. My mother sat beside him, holding his hand. The sight of them together still twisted something inside me. The knowledge of her betrayal, a constant undercurrent. My father's face lit up when he saw me. Nora, he called, reaching out his free hand. My girl came home. I hurried to his side, embracing him carefully around the monitoring wires. Of course I did, Dad. You scared me. My mother stood and offered a stiff hug. Nora, you look professional. Have you lost weight? And just like that, the criticism began, not even 5 minutes into our reunion. It's good to see you too, Mum, I said neutrally, focusing my attention back on my father. The doctors confirmed what Ethan had told me. It was a mild heart attack, a warning sign rather than a major event. With medication, dietary changes, and cardiac rehabilitation, my father was expected to make a full recovery. He would be discharged the following day. "The timing is actually perfect," my mother said as we walked to the parking lot that evening. "We've already planned the family gathering for this weekend to celebrate David's retirement last month. Now it can be a recovery celebration too." My stomach dropped. Family gathering? I thought I was just coming to help Dad get settled at home. "Oh no, everyone's coming," she said with a wave of her hand. "Your aunts, uncles, cousins. We've been planning it for months. Surely you can stay through the weekend." Unless your job is more important than your family, of course. The familiar guilt trip. I had planned to stay only 3 days, just long enough to ensure my father was stable before returning to San Francisco. The thought of a house full of relatives with my mother holding court was daunting. But looking at my father's hopeful expression, I couldn't bring myself to disappoint him. "Of course I'll stay," I said. My first night back in my childhood home was surreal. My old bedroom had been preserved like a museum exhibit. The same floral bedspread, the same posters on the walls, the same books on the shelves. I felt like an adult trying to fit into a child's space, which in many ways mirrored how I felt returning to my family dynamic. Dinner that night was tense. My mother had prepared all my father's favourite foods despite the doctor's new dietary restrictions. "One last hurrah before the rabbit food begins," she declared, serving him a large portion of pot roast. Ethan and his wife Jessica joined us, bringing their 2-year-old daughter Lily, a curly-haired toddler, who immediately won my heart. I had only met my niece once before, a fact that Jessica subtly referenced several times during dinner. "She was just asking about her Aunt Nora last week," Jessica said, bouncing Lily on her lap. "Weren't you, sweetie, asking where the pretty lady in the pictures lives?" My mother snorted softly. "Well, Aunt Nora is very busy with her important job in California. Too busy for family most of the time." I took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Lewis's advice about not engaging with passive-aggressive comments. "I'm here now," I said, smiling at Lily, "and I brought a special teddy bear all the way from San Francisco just for you." My father watched our interaction with sad eyes. It was clear he was aware of the undercurrents but felt powerless to change them. He looked physically weaker than I had ever seen him, and the sight strengthened my resolve to get through the weekend without confrontation for his sake. After dinner, I escaped to the back porch to call Kate my best friend since college, and the only person who knew the full story about my mother's affair. "I don't know if I can do this," I confessed, watching the sunset through the maple trees in the backyard. Being around her makes me feel like I'm 16 again, powerless and guilty and angry all at once. "You are not powerless," Kate reminded me firmly. "You're the marketing director at one of the top agencies in San Francisco. You negotiate with difficult clients every day. You can handle a weekend with your mother. Business is different," I sighed. "There are rules, boundaries. Family is messier." "Then establish boundaries," Kate said. "You don't have to engage with her manipulation. You're there for your dad, period. And Nora, it's been 14 years. Maybe it's time to consider whether keeping this secret is still serving any purpose." I couldn't imagine revealing the truth after all this time. What would it accomplish except to hurt my father when he was already vulnerable? No, I had made my decision years ago, and I would stick with it. I just needed to get through this weekend. "I'll be fine," I told Kate with more confidence than I felt. "It's just a few days." Little did I know that this family gathering would change the course of all our lives. Saturday arrived with a flurry of activity. My mother had hired caterers to handle the food, but she still bustled around the house rearranging flowers and straightening picture frames. My father sat in his favourite armchair, looking bemused by all the fuss. "Your mother wants everything perfect," he said when I brought him his medication, as if anyone cares whether the napkins match the tablecloth. I smiled, grateful for these quiet moments with him. "How are you feeling today, Dad, really?" He patted my hand. "Better for having you here, Nora. I've missed you." The simple sincerity in his voice made my throat tight. "I've missed you too, Dad." "Then maybe come home more often." "Home," he suggested gently. "Whatever happened between you and your mother? Can't you try to move past it? For an old man with a dodgy heart." The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. "That's not fair, Dad." "I know," he sighed. "I just want my family together before—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. The heart attack had made him think about his mortality. I squeezed his hand. "I'll try, Dad. I really will." By noon, the house was filled with relatives. My father's sister Susan arrived first, a whirlwind of energy and forthright opinions. Aunt Susan had always been my favourite relative, largely because she was the only one who seemed to see through my mother's perfect housewife facade. "Nora," she exclaimed, wrapping me in a hug that smelled of Chanel No. 5. "Let me look at you. Gorgeous as ever, and I hear you're conquering the business world. Good for you for escaping this small pond." From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother bristle at the implication that our hometown was somehow inadequate. "Thanks, Aunt Susan. It's really good to see you." More relatives arrived in quick succession. My father's brothers and their wives' cousins I hadn't seen in years, my mother's sister and her husband. It was strange reconnecting with family members who knew only the sanitized version of our family story. They asked about my job, my apartment in San Francisco, whether I was dating anyone. Not at the moment. I answered the dating question for what felt like the 20th time. "Work keeps me pretty busy." "Don't wait too long," advised my mother's cousin Barbara. "Your biological clock won't wait for that corner office." Before I could respond to this unwelcome comment, my mother swept in. "Nora has always prioritized her career over personal relationships," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Not all of us are meant for family life, I suppose." I bit my tongue, reminding myself I was here for my father. Speaking of whom, he seemed to be enjoying himself despite his recent health scare, holding court in the living room as relatives stopped by to wish him well. I focused on spending time with him and catching up with cousins I genuinely liked, strategically avoiding my mother as much as possible. Aunt Susan cornered me in the kitchen as I was refilling my water glass. "Your mother is in rare form today," she observed dryly. 3 backhanded compliments in the space of 5 minutes must be some kind of record. I laughed despite myself. "You noticed that, huh?" "Hard to miss," Susan replied. "I've never understood what my brother sees in that woman, to be honest. But love is blind, or so they say." She studied me over the rim of her wine glass. "You look good, Nora. California agrees with you. But there's something in your eyes. A sadness that wasn't there when you were young." Before I could respond, there was a commotion at the front door. I peered around the corner and felt my blood freeze. Thomas Wilson and his wife Laura had just arrived bearing a fruit basket for my father. "I didn't know they were coming," I whispered more to myself than to Susan. Susan raised an eyebrow. "The Wilsons, that they're practically family. Of course they'd come for David." I watched as my mother greeted them, her smile tight and her body language stiff. Thomas looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room until they landed on me. The flash of panic in his expression would have been comical if the situation weren't so painful. "Excuse me," I murmured to Susan, retreating to the bathroom where I could collect myself. In the safety of the locked bathroom, I leaned against the sink, taking deep breaths. 14 years had passed, but seeing Thomas and my mother in the same room still made me feel physically ill. Had their affair truly ended all those years ago, or had it continued in some form? The thought made me dizzy. When I emerged, the gathering was moving to the backyard where tables had been set up for dinner. I took a seat beside Ethan, hoping my brother would provide some buffer against the tension I felt. Ethan had always been charming and sociable, taking after our mother in his ability to work a room. He introduced me to distant relatives who had arrived late, filling me in on family gossip in between introductions. I noticed that he seemed to be avoiding alcohol, unusual for social events, where he typically enjoyed a few beers. "Not drinking today?" I asked during a lull in the conversation. Ethan glanced toward Jessica, who was helping Lily with her food at another table. "We've got some news we're planning to announce today," he said with a grin. "Jessica's pregnant again. We're hoping for a boy this time." "Ethan, that's wonderful," I exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. Despite our complicated relationship, I wanted good things for my brother. "When are you due?" "Early January," he said proudly. "We're going to name him David if it's a boy after Dad." The gesture brought tears to my eyes. For all our family's dysfunction, there was real love there too. Dinner was a lively affair with multiple conversations happening simultaneously around the large collection of tables. My mother, always the perfect hostess, moved from group to group, ensuring everyone had what they needed. I noticed she was drinking more than usual, a glass of wine constantly in her hand. Thomas and Laura were seated at a table far from my mother, a deliberate arrangement that I suspected was my mother's doing. The tension between them was palpable, at least to me. Did no one else notice how they carefully avoided each other's gaze? How they never ended up in the same conversation group? After the main course, my father stood to make a toast. He looked better than he had in days, colour in his cheeks and a sparkle in his eyes. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," he said, his voice strong despite his recent illness. "Looking around at all your faces, family and friends who have been with us through good times and bad, I feel like the richest man in the world. He raised his glass of sparkling water. To family, the ones we're born to and the ones we choose. No wealth can compare. Tears pricked my eyes as everyone raised their glasses. My father caught my gaze across the tables and smiled, a private moment of connection that reminded me why I had agreed to come this weekend. As dessert was being served, Ethan stood and clinked his glass. "Jessica and I have an announcement," he said, beaming as he placed his hand on his wife's shoulder. "We're expecting our second child in January, and if it's a boy, we're naming him after the best man I know, my father David." The tables erupted in cheers and congratulations. My father looked stunned, then deeply moved. He embraced Ethan, then Jessica, tears streaming down his face. My mother was in her element, accepting congratulations as if the pregnancy were her own achievement. "Another grandbaby," she exclaimed to anyone who would listen. "And named after David, isn't that perfect?" The celebration continued as coffee was served. People began sharing family stories and memories, many centered around my father. The mood was nostalgic and warm, until my mother, now on her fourth or fifth glass of wine, began to speak. "I have a few memories to share too," my mother announced, her voice slightly slurred, but commanding attention nonetheless. She stood at the head of the main table, wine glass in hand. "About what it takes to be a good mother and wife." An uneasy silence fell over the gathering. My father shifted in his seat, clearly sensing what I already knew. My mother's filter was dissolving with each sip of wine. "Do you know what I gave up for this family?" She continued, her gaze sweeping across the tables before landing on me. "I had a promising career as a pianist. I could have played in symphonies, traveled the world. But I gave it all up to raise my children and support my husband." This was a familiar narrative, one my mother had constructed over the years. The reality was quite different. She had been a moderately talented piano student who had never progressed beyond local recitals. But in her revisionist history, she had sacrificed a brilliant career for her family. "I put every penny we had into Nora's education," she continued, the lie flowing smoothly from her lips. "We remortgaged the house so she could attend that fancy college in California. Did she ever thank me? No. She just ran away and barely looks back." I felt all eyes turn to me. This was blatantly untrue. My education had been funded primarily through scholarships and my own part-time jobs. The small contribution my parents had made came from my father's salary, not from any sacrifice on my mother's part. I cleared my throat. "That's not exactly how it happened, Mom. My scholarships covered most of my tuition, and I worked to pay for the rest." My mother's eyes flashed. "Are you calling me a liar, Nora? In front of everyone?" "I'm just clarifying the facts," I said, quietly determined not to escalate the situation. "You and Dad helped where you could, and I've always been grateful for that." My father attempted to change the subject. "The important thing is that Nora got a great education and has built a successful career. We're very proud of her." But my mother wasn't ready to let it go. The alcohol had loosened something in her, some deep well of resentment that was now spilling over. "Proud," she scoffed, "of a daughter who abandoned her family, who visits once every 3 years, who couldn't even be bothered to come home for Christmas last year when I spent weeks preparing. Rachel," my father warned, but she was on a roll now. "You all think I'm the bad guy," she said, gesturing wildly with her wine glass, causing some to slosh onto the tablecloth. "But you don't know what I've had to deal with. The ingratitude, the rebellion. Nora was always difficult right from the beginning. Nothing I did was ever good enough for her." The gathering had gone completely silent, guests exchanging uncomfortable glances. Ethan looked mortified, Jessica was staring at her plate, and my father's face had gone pale with stress, exactly what his doctors had warned against. "Mum, I think that's enough," Ethan said firmly. "This is supposed to be a celebration for Dad." "Oh, so now you're taking her side too," my mother snapped. "Perfect. Everyone's against me as usual." I stood up slowly. "I think I'm going to help clear some plates," I said, desperate to escape the situation before it deteriorated further. That's when it happened. My mother slammed her wine glass down on the table and pointed at me, her face contorted with rage and hurt. "You ruined my life," she shouted, the words echoing across the suddenly silent backyard. "Everything was fine until you had to make things all about you. You always have to be the center of attention, the perfect daughter everyone feels sorry for. Well, I'm sick of it." I felt as if I'd been slapped. Tears sprang to my eyes, but I blinked them back, unwilling to break down in front of everyone. 24 years of emotional abuse crystallized in that moment. The gaslighting, the manipulation, the way she had twisted my reality until I doubted my own worth. And something inside me broke. Or perhaps something was finally set free. I stood there, tears threatening to spill over, but my voice was steady when I finally spoke. I kept your secret for 14 years. I said the words cutting through the shocked silence. My mother froze, the colour draining from her face. Nora, don't, she whispered. But I couldn't stop now. The truth that had been burning inside me for so long demanded to be released. When I was 16, I came home early from school with a migraine. I continued, my voice growing stronger. I found my mother in bed with Dad's best friend, Thomas. They'd been having an affair for a year. Gasps echoed around the tables. Thomas jumped to his feet, his wife Laura staring at him in horror. My father sat completely still, as if turned to stone. Mom begged me not to tell. She said it would destroy our family, ruin Ethan's life, break Dad's heart. She convinced me that keeping her secret was the loving thing to do. So I did. I carried that burden alone for 14 years. I turned to face my mother directly. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? You used that secret as a weapon against me. You threatened to tell Dad it was somehow my fault if I didn't do what you wanted. You made me complicit in your betrayal. My mother attempted to regain control of the situation. She's lying, she said desperately, looking around for support. Nora has always been unstable, always seeking attention. Thomas, tell them this is ridiculous. But Thomas couldn't meet anyone's eyes. His silence was confirmation enough. That's why I left for college as far away as possible, I continued. That's why I've kept my distance all these years. Not because I don't love my family, but because every time I'm around you, Mom, I'm reminded of how you made me an accessory to your betrayal of Dad. Aunt Susan stepped forward, her face grim. I suspected something was going on between you two back then, she said, looking between my mother and Thomas. The way you looked at each other at family gatherings. I never had proof, but I knew. My mother's face crumpled. It wasn't like that, she protested weakly. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. A year-long moment of weakness, I challenged. And using your daughter to cover it up, was that a mistake too? Ethan stood up, his face a mask of confusion and pain. Is this true? He asked, looking between our mother and me. Mom, Nora. For a moment, I thought my mother would continue to deny everything. But then, faced with the weight of evidence and the condemning silence from Thomas, she collapsed into her chair and began to sob. I never meant for any of this to happen, she wailed. I was unhappy, and Thomas was there for me. It was a terrible mistake, but it was so long ago. Why bring it up now except to hurt me? The gathering began to break up in uncomfortable confusion. Thomas and Laura were the first to leave, departing without a word to anyone. Other relatives made awkward excuses, gathering their belongings and children. Through it all, my father hadn't said a word. He sat in his chair, staring at nothing, tears silently tracking down his face. The sight of his pain was almost unbearable. Had I done the right thing in revealing the truth after all these years, or had I just caused more damage? As the last guests hurriedly departed, I was left standing in the wreckage of our family gathering, wondering if the truth had set us free or simply shattered what little connection we had managed to maintain all these years. The house fell into an eerie silence after the last guest departed. My mother had retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. Ethan and Jessica had taken Lily home, Ethan promising to return in the morning after he had time to process everything. Aunt Susan was the last to leave, squeezing my hand and whispering, "Call me if you need anything, day or night." I was left alone with my father in the living room. He hadn't moved from his chair, still staring into the middle distance. I knelt beside him, terrified that the shock had triggered another heart attack. "Dad, should I call the doctor?" He slowly focused on my face. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm not having a heart attack, though it feels a bit like one." I reached for his hand. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you all these years, but maybe I was just being a coward." My father squeezed my hand, then gestured to the sofa across from him. "Sit down, Nora. I think it's time we talked. Really talked." I perched on the edge of the sofa, my heart pounding. I had no idea what he was going to say, whether he would blame me for keeping the secret or for revealing it, whether he would defend my mother or condemn her. "I need to apologize to you," he said, surprising me completely. "Apologize for what?" "For failing you as a father," he said, his voice breaking. "For not seeing what was happening in my own home. For putting the burden of peacekeeping on your shoulders from such a young age. For not protecting you from your mother's issues." Tears filled my eyes. "Dad, no, you were always there for me." He shook his head sadly. "Not in the ways that mattered most. I knew your mother could be difficult, critical, I saw how she treated you differently from Ethan, but I told myself it wasn't that bad, that all mothers and daughters have complicated relationships. I took the path of least resistance because it was easier than confronting the truth. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking his full 65 years. The worst part is, I suspected something was going on between your mother and Thomas. There were signs, late-night phone calls, changes in her behavior, the way she would suddenly mention his name in conversation for no reason. But I didn't want to know. I buried my head in the sand. This confession stunned me. You knew. I had suspicions, not proof, he clarified. And like a coward, I chose not to investigate those suspicions. Then you changed, became withdrawn, stopped talking to me the way you used to. I knew something significant had happened, but I was afraid to ask, afraid of the answer. I thought about all the years of silence, all the pain that could have been avoided if we had simply been honest with each other. What happens now? I asked quietly. My father sighed heavily. I don't know. I need time to think. Your mother and I, we have a lot to discuss. 35 years of marriage isn't something you walk away from easily, even after a revelation like this. But things can't go back to the way they were. He looked at me intently. But what about you, Nora? Where do you go from here? Now that the secret is out? It was a good question, and one I hadn't had time to consider in the chaos of the evening. The weight I had carried for 14 years was gone, but in its place was uncertainty. I don't know either, I admitted. But I think I'd like to try to rebuild our relationship, without the secret between us. My father's eyes filled with tears. I'd like that too, sweetheart. Very much. We sat together in the quiet living room for a long time, talking more openly than we had in years. About my childhood, my mother's treatment of me, the reasons I had stayed away. About his regrets, his fears for the future, his pride in the woman I had become despite everything. It was nearly midnight when I finally went upstairs to my old bedroom. As I passed my parents' room, I could hear my mother crying softly. For a moment, I considered knocking, trying to talk to her. But it was too soon. We both needed time. The next morning, my mother was gone. She had left a note saying she was staying with her sister for a while. I need to think, she had written, about everything. Ethan came over as promised, and the three of us, my father, my brother and I, sat around the kitchen table trying to make sense of what had happened. Why didn't you tell me? Ethan asked, hurt evident in his voice. All these years I thought you just abandoned us because you were too good for our small town life. I was trying to protect you, I said. You were only 13 when it happened. And later, well, you and I were never that close. I didn't know how to bridge that gap. Ethan nodded slowly. I always took Mum's side, he acknowledged. It was easier. She would get so upset if I didn't. I'm sorry for that, Nora. It was the first real apology I had ever received from my brother, and it meant more than I could express. Instead of returning to San Francisco as planned, I extended my stay indefinitely. My father needed support both emotionally and practically as he recovered from his heart attack. I worked remotely, setting up a makeshift office in the dining room. Rachel stayed away for 2 weeks, then returned with a tentative proposal. She would move into the guest room while she and my father decided what to do about their marriage. She had also apparently begun seeing a therapist. Her first attempt at an apology to me was predictably self-centered. I never meant to hurt you, Nora. I was just so unhappy back then. You have to understand. I cut her off. I don't have to understand anything, Mom. What you did was wrong. Not just the affair, but making me complicit in it, using it against me for years. If you want a relationship with me going forward, you need to acknowledge that without excuses. It was the first time in my life I had set a clear boundary with my mother and stuck to it. Her eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't argue. Progress of a sort. Over the following weeks, we began the slow, painful process of rebuilding our family relationships. There were tears, accusations, and difficult conversations. But there was also gradually honesty. My father and mother entered couples counselling. I wasn't privy to their sessions, but my father shared that they were addressing not just the affair, but the decades of dynamics that had led to it. Whether their marriage would survive remained an open question, but they were both committed to finding a healthier way forward together or apart. Ethan and I began to forge a real sibling relationship for the first time. Without our mother's triangulation and favoritism, we discovered we actually enjoyed each other's company. I became a more present aunt to Lily, and I promised to be there when the new baby arrived. As for my mother and me, our relationship remained the most complicated. Decades of emotional abuse couldn't be undone in a few weeks of honesty. But there were small moments of connection, a genuine compliment about my work, a memory shared without manipulation, a request for my opinion that wasn't a trap. After a month in Minnesota, I returned to San Francisco with a promise to visit again soon. And this time I meant it. The truth, painful as it had been, had created an opening for healing that hadn't existed before. 1 year later, I returned to Minnesota for another family gathering. This one was smaller, just immediate family plus Aunt Susan, to celebrate my father's full recovery and my new position as executive director of my agency's San Francisco office. So much had changed in that year. My father and mother had separated for 6 months, then decided to give their marriage another chance on entirely new terms. They had sold the family home and moved into a smaller house, a fresh start, symbolically as well as practically. My father had taken up painting, discovering a talent none of us had known he possessed. My mother had returned to playing piano, not as the concert career she had mythologized, but as a genuine source of joy. They were, in their own words, dating each other again. Ethan and Jessica's son, little David, was now 6 months old, a chubby, happy baby who had his grandfather's gentle eyes. Lily, now 3, had appointed herself his official protector and would solemnly report to me on his activities when we spoke on video calls. My relationship with my mother remained a work in progress. She still occasionally slipped into old patterns, and I sometimes found myself bracing for the criticism or manipulation that had characterized our relationship for so long. But we were both trying, which was more than I would have believed possible a year ago. The most significant change, though, was within myself. The unburdening of the secret had created space for healing I hadn't known I needed. With the help of therapy and the support of friends like Kate, I had begun to address the deep-seated patterns that had developed from growing up with emotional abuse. I was learning to trust, to set boundaries, to believe in my own perceptions rather than doubting them. These changes had rippled into my personal life as well. 6 months after the confrontation, I had met Michael, a kind and straightforward architectural engineer who approached relationships with the same honesty I was learning to embrace. It was too soon to know where our relationship was heading, but for the first time, I was open to the possibility of a future that included partnership. As we sat around the dinner table that evening, I looked at each member of my family, flawed, complex, trying their best in their own ways. The tensions were still there. The history couldn't be erased, but there was also something new: authenticity. My father raised his glass for a toast. To truth, he said simply. Painful as it can be, it's the only solid ground to build on. We all drank to that, even my mother. Later, as we were cleaning up, my father pulled me aside. I want you to know something, Nora, he said quietly. That day when you finally spoke the truth after all those years, it was one of the most courageous things I've ever witnessed. It would have been easier to stay silent, to keep the peace like I taught you to do, but you chose the harder path, and in doing so, you freed all of us. He touched my cheek gently. We don't heal by burying the past, but by bringing it into the light. You taught me that. His words stayed with me long after I returned to San Francisco. The truth had indeed been painful, for all of us, but it had also been necessary. The secret had been a poison in our family system, corrupting everything it touched. Only by exposing it to the light could we begin to heal. I think of that family gathering often, the shock on everyone's faces, my mother's desperate attempts to maintain control, my father's silent tears. It was a breaking point, yes, but also a turning point. Sometimes you have to break apart the old structure completely before you can build something new and stronger. If you've ever had to reveal a difficult truth to someone you love, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Was it worth it? Did it lead to healing or more pain? And if you're carrying a secret right now that's weighing you down, I hope my story gives you courage. Hit that like button if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and speaking your truth. Subscribe for more stories about family dynamics and healing. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles with difficult family members. Thank you for listening, and remember, the truth doesn't guarantee a happy ending, but it does offer the possibility of an authentic one. And sometimes that's even better.